Welcome to this installment of the Advanced Introduction to International Political Economy lecture series. Today, we'll be discussing Global South approaches to IPE. And importantly, this is not meant to be a kind of comprehensive or an exhaustive account of the subject, but rather my point here is to present to you some key thinkers and theories that have been developed out of the Global South and that you could utilize in your own sort of studies and research around IPE. So I won't focus on sort of specific issues such as monetary sovereignty, financialization, or debt, but rather on these interpretive and analytical frameworks that you can then utilize. Now, importantly, these are also theories and methodologies that are interdisciplinary in character, and thus they're not just about IPE itself, but I hope to show that they're nonetheless really relevant to thinking about these central issues in IPE today, and maybe even opening some new avenues for future IPE research. In terms of structure, I'll begin with a discussion about the concept of the coloniality of knowledge, and think a bit about why the approaches we're going to be discussing today do not generally occupy a central position in IPE syllabi and teaching. Then we'll move on to the anti-colonial and black radical traditions, which lay a kind of foundation for many theories and thinkers coming out of the Global South. And then we'll move on to two concepts. The first one is racial capitalism. The second one is the coloniality of power. And finally, we're going to think a bit about what it would mean to decolonize IPE and what the relevance of these themes we'll be discussing today have for IPE research. So, thinking with and from the Global South. To begin with, I think it's in order to discuss the operative word here, which is the Global South. So I think most people think of the term in exclusively geographical ways, but I would suggest that we look at it from a different angle. So instead of looking at it from a sort of perspective that it's a spatially fixed location, we would do well to see the Global South more so as a relational position of subalternity. What do I mean by this? Well, basically, I mean that it's not so much about your geographical location, but more about your position in relation to social, economic, and political hierarchies. So, for example, you can have oppressed and marginalized people geographically located in the Northern Hemisphere that could be considered to fall under the umbrella term of the Global South due to their social, economic, and political location in the societies which they occupy. And so these could include, for example, indigenous people or negatively racialized peoples. And in thinking about thinkers that come from the Global South, it's important to point out that many of these have had to face a different set of obstacles, challenges that those of us who come from the Global North have to. And as an example, we could take an indigenous scholar working on IPE issues relating to, for example, how financial mechanisms have been used to subjugate and undermine indigenous claims to sovereignty. Now, this scholar will have a much harder time getting her research published, validated, getting a good position within the university system, and getting her work legitimated. While a scholar working on sort of normative issues in IPE, not going against the grain, is not going to face the same challenges. And so I think the coloniality of knowledge as a concept can help us explain this conundrum. The concept comes out of the work of Onni Ahvonen and the decolonial school. We'll discuss these later on. But in essence, it tries to explain why some knowledges and forms of knowledge production are considered legitimate, validated, apolitical, universal, neutral, scientific, and so forth, while others, that is to say non-Western knowledges, are deemed biased, subjective, illegitimate, even irrational, and so forth. So essentially, the concept refers to these kinds of global epistemic regimes or orders of knowledge production, which produce, reproduce, and entrench the deemed supremacy of Western knowledges over those of others. And so it's very much tied to material realities and, the hierarchies between rich and poor nations, for example. So take, for example, this indigenous scholar working on critical IPE issues. If that scholar draws from Southern theory, she is expected to cite and to refer to theories and thinkers arising from the global North who occupy a central position within the field, but scholars in the West are not expected to refer to or cite or even be aware of Southern theories. And so the relevant questions that the coloniality of knowledge tries to explain is, what is considered to be scientific knowledge and what is not, who is considered to be a capable knowledge producer, who is not, whose knowledges are centered and whose are marginalized, and so forth. And another example of this is, for example, academic publishing. We know that the respected peer-reviewed journals that mostly come from the global North produce and publish mostly the text of scholars in the global North, while just a tiny percentage comes out of the global South. And so this is another manifestation of how the coloniality of knowledge operates inside of academia. Now, getting into the specific critical theories and analytical frameworks we're going to discuss today, I would say that generally their function is to confront Eurocentrism, to confront methodological whiteness by sort of centering issues of race and racialization in their analysis, and confronting the coloniality of knowledge, that is to say, these hierarchies of global knowledge production that we have outlined above. So, moving on to the anti-colonial and Black radical tradition. I would argue that these lay the foundation on which later conceptualizations of racial capitalism and coloniality of power are built. The anti-colonial and Black radical tradition emerges in a vocal opposition to colonial rule, to global white supremacy and forms of racial dehumanization, and also to neocolonialism and the fact that even though many nation states in the global South got their independence from colonial rule, they were still economically subjugated by Western countries. And so these are some of the things that anti-colonial scholars have sort of confronted in their work and actions. Some of the key works of this tradition include Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. It includes Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, Kwame Nkrumah's Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism, and other similar works. What unifies these different thinkers is that all of them sort of put race and colonialism at the center of their analysis of political economy and capitalism. That is to say, they do not conceive of these things as epiphenomenal or secondary issues. And in doing so, many of these thinkers were inspired by Marxism and even identified as Marxists. But their brand of Marxism differs quite a lot from that which we have been accustomed to reading if we're only familiar with the text of European Marxists or the classical Marxist tradition. Coming from these distinct social, political, and historical contexts, mainly ones influenced by slavery and colonialism, these thinkers used Marxism's methodological and theoretical tools to understand and analyze the colonial and post-colonial situation. And in doing so, their analyses necessarily differed from European Marxists insofar as they were primarily concerned with the plight of the colonized peoples and not just the working class. And Frantz Fanon is probably the most famous of these anti-colonial figures. And he described this sort of conceptual move as that of stretching Marxism. And so in his famous book, he writes that, quote, "In the colonies, the economic substructure is also a superstructure. The cause is the consequence. You're rich because you're white because you're rich. This is why Marxist analysis should always be slightly stretched every time we have to do with the colonial problem. So, what does Fanon mean by this? Basically, if we compare it to Karl Marx again, who set forth the argument that capitalism's primary contradiction is found between labor power and capital, and that their interests are diametrically opposed to one another under capitalism. But Fanon notes that in the colonial situation, this simple juxtaposition between the two isn't that simple. That is to say, it requires more analytical clarity. And for Fanon, the primary contradiction in the colonial situation is found between the colonizers and the colonized. And he also remarked how the class composition and class formation of colonized societies differed quite a bit from those societies that Marx analyzed when he looked at Western Europe and industrialization, for example. And so hence the need for stretching Marxism when looking at the colonial context. And I think this discussion of the anti-colonial and Black radical tradition provides a good primer for our first analytical framework, which is that of racial capitalism. The concept of racial capitalism has developed in numerous places. The earliest examples of term's explicit usage comes from the work of South African Marxists, people like Martin Legasik and Neville Alexander, for example. But it's probably most famously related to the work of Cedric Robinson, who wrote a book called Black Marxism, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition, which came out in the early 1980s. And recently, the concept has gained more visibility in the social sciences as a result of the popularization of Robinson's work, and of course, in relation to the Black Lives Matter movement also. So, what is racial capitalism? Racial capitalism is a concept that tries to shed light on the racial foundation of capitalism. It shows how capitalism has always required some kind of means of producing, reproducing, or maintaining differences and divisions between groups of people, and that these differences and divisions have been made possible by different kinds of racial ideologies. Now, importantly, when we're talking about race, we're not talking about it in any kind of biological sense, but rather as a social construction which nonetheless has crucial material implications on people's lives. So racial capitalism, for example, tries to explain the divisions between informal and formal work, between free wage labor and coerced labor, between skilled and unskilled labor, the employed and the unemployed, and so forth, and argues that racial categories and racial ideology marks all of these divisions. And also it sheds light on why there's such big gaps between racial groups in terms of living conditions, housing, education, and so forth, and that all of these is places where racial capitalism is manifested in. And so racial capitalism essentially highlights how it's indeed impossible to think about class or capitalism in isolation or without understanding how race and racism structures class formations and processes of capital accumulation in both local and global contexts. A concrete example could be apartheid South Africa, for example. So in apartheid South Africa, depending on how you were racialized, this would have a massive effect on your material realities and opportunities in life, on the kind of work you could do, the education level you could attain, even your sort of personal relationships were determined by the racial category which you were deemed to belong to. And so here in this context, the famous Marxist slogan of "Workers of the World Unite" was quite redundant, given the fact that the relatively good social and economic position of white workers was directly linked to the racial subjugation of black workers, of peasants, and the unemployed. And in fact, this is highlighted by the slogan of the white miners in 1922, where they yelled that "Workers of the world unite and fight for a white South Africa." And this is the kind of things that racial capitalism tries to sort of highlight and analyze. And so, as the South African case highlights, racism and racialization are not separate processes from capitalism, but rather the two were tied at the hip. So in contrast to the work of Marxists like David Harvey or Ellen Meeks Wood, racism is not just an ideological tool that is used to divide the workers, but rather a structural reality of capitalist development from the get-go. And so this is quite sort of pertinently put by Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who writes that capitalism requires inequality and racism enshrines it. And this leads us to our next analytical framework, which is that of the coloniality of power, which is quite similar to racial capitalism. But before that, I'd like you to watch this video of Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and specifically the first 8 minutes or so of it, and think about how could the concept of racial capitalism help you to think about economic inequality on a global scale.